So thank you everyone for coming. Thanks to Joe and Steve and the Center for Mark Twain Studies. Thanks for hosting me up at Quarry Farm. It's a delightful place and very productive and very relaxing. So thanks for having me here. So this is going to be new material that I've written mostly while here, and it's towards my dissertation, which was just very briefly described. I want to start with a short anecdote. So during 1885, the lecture tour promoting Huckleberry Finn, the same tour where Twain picked up a copy of Morte d'Arthur and conceived of Connecticut Yankee. Morte d'Arthur is the Legends of King Arthur by Mallory. He visited his mother for the last time. Twain later wrote about this visit in his autobiography. Jane Clemens was in her 80s. Her memory was fading. During their conversations, Twain felt the noble and heroic impulse to confess one of his childhood sins. 35 years earlier, Twain had lied to his mom and to the entire town about being mesmerized. So mesmerism is this concept that you can control someone else's mind, make them experience visions or be impervious to pain. And there was a traveling mesmerist, and Twain volunteered to be the subject of the demonstration. And he pretended not to be hurt by the pins stuck into his arm, and to know the history of the house where the performance was held. And so in this final visit to his mother, he's in his 50s and his mother is in her 80s, he confessed. He said, "I had faked my mesmeric trances." But his mother didn't believe him. She said, Twain writes, "It did not affect her at all. It did not budge her the fraction of an inch from her position. Dear, dear, what a grotesque and unthinkable situation. A confessed swindler, convicted of honesty, and condemned to acquittal." So he's annoyed at her, and this is like a 15-page article where he's sort of ranting about why his mother didn't believe his confession. And he writes, "The lie which I played upon her in my youth remained with her as an unchallengeable truth to the day of her death." This is a picture of the tour, the lecture tour, and his mother. So, maybe too soon. So I'm wondering, is this story a joke about Twain's mother losing her mind, or else too stubborn to believe him? Or is the joke about Twain himself, who gets frustrated at the inefficacy of his arguments? And some might be reminded of Tom Sawyer's fake dream. After Tom runs away from home, he secretly returns to Aunt Polly, and he describes eavesdropping, he describes his eavesdropping as though it were a clairvoyant dream. But Aunt Polly likes the tale. She says, "It's a good lie. It's a blessed, blessed lie." So was Twain's childhood lie about being mesmerized also a good lie? Because it brought joy and comfort to its listeners, to his mother? More broadly, what did Twain think about the politics of belief? What about those who tell, who believe in, or who choose to believe in falsehoods? The story of Twain's middle-aged confession also speaks to the political trajectory of his career. Unlike some of the great novelists of the 19th century, Charles Dickens, Louisa May Alcott, Twain becomes more disillusioned and more politically radical as he ages. The last few decades of his life, from the mid-1880s onwards, Twain experiences a falling out of faith, not only with Christianity, which had begun earlier, but also in science, in government, in American society. Twain engaged in serious, piercing critiques of imperialism and capitalism. The questions that Twain wrestled with in the last 3 decades of his life are the questions that occupy my dissertation: how the consolidation of the American imperial state and the scientific institutions that uphold it leave an opening for critique by novelists, by writers of good lies. Further, I ask how these writers use pseudo-science, like mesmerism, sciences that by this time people already knew were fake, and yet still, like Twain's own mother, chose to believe. I consider how pseudosciences helped writers criticize science and empire. So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about Twain's novel Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, before comparing the novel to two other politically minded time travel narratives, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, which was published a year before, and H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, which was published several years later. And I'll conclude with some thoughts on Twain's late work on pseudo-science and anti-imperialism. So, for those who haven't read it, Connecticut Yankee is, and assuming a lot of people have read it, Connecticut Yankee tells the story of Hank Morgan, a man who works at a weapons factory in suburban Connecticut, who travels through time and space to end up in medieval England. After arriving in King Arthur's court, Hank engages in a contest for power. He uses modern technology to beat the magician Merlin in a series of performances, and these duels form a through line to an otherwise episodic plot. Several critics compare the novel to Don Quixote, including William Dean Howells. Between bouts with Merlin and other adventures, Hank forms a shadow government, but when the church feels threatened, he ends up fighting a civil war, killing 25,000 people with dynamite, electric fences, and machine guns. After entirely destroying the society he had attempted to reform, he returns to the present, and he's sort of, he's a broken man, as it were. In Kurt Vonnegut's words, this novel was, quote, founding the genre we now call science fiction. It's a technologically speculative political narrative, and among other claims to fame, President Roosevelt got the term the New Deal from this book. As an aside, the book was illustrated by Dan Beard, who Twain picks personally, and whom Twain enthusiastically defended even after reviewers pointed out that his illustrations were probably more radical than Twain intended. For example, he drew Merlin as the British poet Tennyson, and he drew a slave driver as the American robber baron Jay Gould. And Beard was actually blacklisted for these drawings, and he struggled to make a living for several years. Twain was also sort of blacklisted, but Twain was too famous for that to hurt him, really, financially. I won't say much more about the images because I'm not really an art historian, but I think they form a very interesting commentary on the book, and I'm going to show them throughout, mostly the Dan Beard images. So given the fact that the novel's plot juxtaposes 19th century Connecticut with medieval England, an enormous amount of criticism on this novel, as the scholar Jane Gardner puts it, discusses Twain's ambivalence toward progress. In many ways, life in medieval England seems worse than life in Twain's world. People lack everyday comforts like running water or soap, and structural freedoms like democracy. On the other hand, the novel throws up all sorts of contradictions. Most obviously, Twain ends with a massacre, so the positive outcomes of modern civilization seem uncertain. Critics often end up debating whether the novel succeeds or fails as an homage to progress. They assume that Twain links science, democracy, and progress, and they ask, does Twain think scientific progress makes society better or worse? I think these questions are a little bit too, so this is sorry to go back, but this is a Dan Beard illustration that's very interesting that sort of compares the oppression of medieval society with contemporary society in Twain's time. Okay, so I think the questions about is progress good or bad are a little too simplistic. The novel undermines the binary of science and progress on the one hand and the superstition and backwardness on the other. Consider that the entire plot hinges on Hank's rivalry with Merlin, which is really just a series of shows that Hank puts on for 6th century audiences. As one critic, Richard Pressman, puts it, Hank tries to out-Merlin Merlin. Quote, the Yankee uses his ingenuity not to alter people's lives for the better, but to alter their allegiance for his own personal advancement. I agree with this, and I want to juxtapose these ideas. First, that the novel pits progress against backwardness, and second, that the novel stages contests between science and superstition as rivals on the same stage. A set of sociologists of science from the 1980s and 1990s, starting with Bruno Latour, make a useful and related claim, which I think Twain anticipates. And they say that science is not fundamentally different from other disciplines, but that it succeeds because it is more successful at recruiting a network of allies. Science is more powerful, that's why it succeeds. So the idea that both Merlin and Hank are performers competing for audiences on the same stage comes through very early in the book. The first time we encounter Merlin, Hank distinguishes himself from this mighty liar as a matter of scale, not of kind. And this is a quote from Hank. "He don't amount to shucks as a magician, knows some of the old common tricks, but has never got beyond the rudiments, and never will. He is well enough for the provinces, one-night stands and that sort of thing, you know. But dear me, he oughtn't to set up for an expert. Anyway, not where there's a real artist." So Merlin is boring, and this is a picture of Merlin as everyone's falling asleep. The flies buzzed and bit unmolested while he tells his story. But both men are performance artists, professional magicians putting on a show. For Twain, there isn't a fundamental difference, as a philosopher might say, neither an epistemological nor an ontological difference, between Merlin's magic and Hank's 19th century technology. You might object and say, well, Merlin is telling a false story, Hank is telling a truthful one. But in the context of the novel, Hank isn't telling a truthful story. When Hank predicts the eclipse, he doesn't explain the calculus of planet trajectories. He gets it out of an almanac. Hank's untruthfulness speaks to how little most of Twain's audience, even a 21st century audience, knows about the increasingly complex science and technology we encounter every day. Well, maybe at one time I did know calculus, but mostly I just Google what time the eclipse is going to be. Gardner, which is the point of Hank, is tricking the audience there, but he also is just getting it out of an almanac. The scholar Gardner makes this case about electricity, where she writes, machines like the induction motor and the dynamo really did function like magic for the 19th century audience. Even as electric lights spread rapidly during the 1880s, most people did not really understand much of the technology, especially electric currents and voltage. Gardner writes, the reality of magic and its difference from science is, if anything, merely one of degree. Or as another scholar writes, both Merlin and the Yankee are frauds. It's not just electricity that Hank represents as magic. Hank even calls the tobacco smoke that comes out of his knight's helmet, so he's smoking a cigar while he's riding his horse, an enchantment which would work harm to none but my enemies. And Hank creates a sense of superstition when none is needed, except to facilitate a more impressive performance. This is him smoking his cigar while he's in his knight's outfit. About halfway through the novel, after Hank has already bested Merlin twice, importantly in this case, the fix is simply that he needs to patch up a well that's not working. But the contract, the people are asking for a miracle, not just to fix a well. The show must go on, and a fixed well is not a show. Hank augments the performance with all the necessary apparatus, including advertisements. Doors open at 10:30, performances to begin at 11:25, through to the solemn stage wait of 20 minutes before he begins, and finishing with Greek fire explosions. Hank doesn't need to dazzle the audience with these German compound word incantations, but he does it anyway because you can't throw too much style into a miracle. That's him dazzling all of these medieval English people. To take one final example of Hank's showmanship and to illustrate that science is not a superior form of debunking, but rather a different kind of magic. After Merlin's defeat, there's another magician that comes onto the scene who purports to be a clairvoyant, to know the future and the past, predicting what any individual on the face of the globe was doing at the moment and what he had done any time in the past. At first, Hank tries to show that this false prophet cannot tell what he is doing with his own hand 3 yards away. He's like, tell me what I'm doing with my hand. But the new magician says, well, you're not an important enough person for me to predict it. So he easily gets out of that debunking. And just like it didn't work with Twain's own mother, Hank's attempts at debunking don't work here. The best way to beat the magician is not to prove that he is false, but to out-magic him. So Hank predicts the king's arrival through the use of telephones, and the new magician gets ridden out on a rail. It's less that Hank disproved a lie, rather that he demonstrated a more powerful one. So in my reading, Twain is as interested in the differences between science and superstition as he is in their similarities. Instead of getting wrapped up in epistemology, we can ask, why does Twain seem to emphasize similarity? The main result, I think, is to show that science is not necessarily attached to progress. By juxtaposing science against superstition, Twain suggests that science is just another system of logic, a system that can be used, like magic, for various ends. Twain is not either simply expressing a technological anxiety nor a celebration of communications technologies, though he's doing both as well, but he's also critiquing how science is used. So now I'm going to go into a comparison with the novels of Edward Bellamy and H.G. Wells, which were published in the same decade. And I think they reveal the consequences of Twain's theorization around science and superstition. Connecticut Yankee is sandwiched between two of these other great time travel narratives, and all three involve significant forward and backward movement in time. All three are some of the earliest examples of this genre. In each, time travel is facilitated by a pseudo-scientific mechanism: magic, mesmerism, or the mystical machine. All three also produce utopias or dystopias, or some combination, that critique or imagine a new sort of politics. In Wells, the narrator famously moves through time with the use of the time machine, though the workings of the machine aren't actually explained in detail. And then in both Bellamy and Twain's novel, time travel proceeds via mesmerism, this same phenomena that Twain faked in his childhood. In Bellamy, the narrator falls asleep, like in Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but the trance state is induced by a mesmeric doctor. Likewise, in Twain's Connecticut Yankee, the jump back in time is sort of unexplained. He gets hit on the head with a crowbar. But the jump forward involves Merlin making passes in the air with his hands, which is reminiscent of mesmerism. The connection between Twain and Bellamy is perhaps the closest and the most obvious. That's Bellamy. All these guys like mustaches. Twain read and loved Bellamy's novel, calling it the latest and best of all Bibles, but he only did so after Connecticut Yankee was fully drafted. That said, it may be possible that Twain heard details about Bellamy's novel from his friend, William Dean Howells, who reviewed Looking Backward in Harper's Monthly in June of 1888, which is the last summer that he was working on Connecticut Yankee here in Elmira, and one of his most productive summers. While there is no concrete evidence that Twain actually read Howells' review, it's very likely he did. The two men were very good friends and correspondents. It also may well be that Twain's extensive writing and rewriting of Connecticut Yankee in the summer of 1888 had something to do with a response to Howells' review of Looking Backward. But he did make, Howells was mostly positive about Looking Backward, but he did make a few negative comments. While Howells concedes that Looking Backward is a didactic utopian romance and should not be read with the same standard as realist fiction, and I'm going to explain the plot of Looking Backward shortly, Howells does call the novel, quote, a sugar-coated form of a dream, and that the character drawing is of the slightest. It's very possible that Twain read this review in the early summer, just as he began to write the ending of Connecticut Yankee, as a warning against making his utopia too optimistic or too sugar-coated. In fact, there is a long debate among scholars, stretching back decades, over exactly why and when Connecticut Yankee transformed from a lighthearted comedy that Twain originally planned into something much more dark and violent. In the 1940s, John Hoban thought that the turn toward darkness came from Twain's anti-British reaction against Matthew Arnold. In the 1960s, Howard Bates Holtz thought that Twain was using the novel to respond to reports about the oppression of Tsarist Russia, so that's probably motivated by Cold War anxieties. And then in the 2000s, Joe Fulton argues for Twain's extensive reading in British and French history, especially Thomas Carlyle, and he finds marginalia that Twain wrote in the books of Carlyle that were found here at Quarry Farm. So others have also spoken about Twain's personal troubles in 1888, such as the Page typesetter fiasco, or the sickness of his brother-in-law, the owner of Quarry Farm, Theodore Crane. So there's a lot of things going on in 1888. All of these critics are probably right. Twain was writing against Arnold, against Russia, against Carlyle, as well as in response to personal crises. And to this mix, I think I'd add that Twain might be responding to Howell's aesthetic appraisal of looking backward, and that Howell's general appreciation for the didactic utopian form, but his warning against too much sugarcoating that happens in Bellamy's Looking Backward. So a little bit about Looking Backward. So even Bellamy acknowledges that this is a fantastic romance. So the plot of this novel is the main character, Julian West, finds himself transported from 1887 to the year 2000, where a state-run bureaucracy controls the entire economy. Everyone has the same wages, and National Socialism has improved everyone's lives. One of West's first questions to his 21st century hosts involved the transition from capitalism to socialism. He asks, "Such a stupendous change did not, of course, take place without bloodshed and terrible convulsions," to which his host responds, "On the contrary, there was absolutely no violence." The lack of violence Bellamy predicts is perhaps the most important example, but the novel is self-consciously optimistic in other ways. Later in the novel, Bellamy has his main character listen to a sermon which discusses the, quote, profound pessimism of the literature of the last quarter of the 19th century, the note of melancholy in its poetry, and the cynicism of its humor. And cynicism of his humor is probably a subtweet of Twain. In contrast to what might be an implicit reference to Twain, Bellamy seems to set up his novel as an optimistic alternative, one that believes human nature is in its essential qualities good. In order for Bellamy's socialist utopia to function, let alone for him to imagine a bloodless revolution, Bellamy has to take a rosy view of human nature. Bellamy even uses the metaphor of a rosebush planted in poor soil for the state of humanity in the late 19th century. In Bellamy's utopia, even falsehood would vanish. The lie of fear was the refuge of cowardice, and the lie of fraud the device of the cheat. And with socialist equality, there would be no need for either. Bellamy's optimism about the disappearance of lying serves as a sort of metonymy for his optimism about the disappearance of violence. Like many of the scientific socialists of the 19th century from which Bellamy emerges, people like Joseph Fourier and Henri de Saint-Simon, Bellamy merged romantic ideas of organic unity with increasing mechanization and industrialization. Along these lines, Bellamy describes his utopian vision as the science of wealth and happiness, a governmental machine that never fights with, miscommunicates, or lies to the people it serves. In other words, the aesthetics, the politics, and the lack of lying in Bellamy's novel are all connected, and all might be set in contrast to Twain's Connecticut Yankee. Twain himself will write of Bellamy several decades later that his novel appeals to people who read and dream and are compassionate and troubled for the poor and the hard-driven, which for Twain is not a majority, but necessarily the few. A bloodless revolution leading to a perfect socialist state requires the sort of Pollyanna-ish belief in the goodness of human nature that Bellamy has, but that in Twain and Howells's mind is too much of a fantasy. In Twain's fiction, think again, maybe Tom Sawyer, for example, people lie and miscommunicate for all sorts of reasons. Some people, like Twain's mother, even prefer being lied to. This means that the gears of the social system can never be as smooth as Bellamy would want. Another mustached guy. Okay. For the final comparison, I'd like to introduce H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, published several years after Connecticut Yankee. The Time Machine is much shorter and much more pessimistic than Bellamy's Prophecy. There's also less evidence of a connection between Twain and Wells, but the comparison between the two novels is still worthwhile. In Wells's narrative, the narrator finds out that the two unequal classes of society, rich and poor, have evolved into two separate species. The childlike Eloi, who's the capitalist class that's sort of become indolent and live above ground, and the lower class is the spidery Morlock, which breeds and eats the Eloi as food. Interestingly, Wells metacritically comments on the other utopian novels in the text of his novel. He writes, in some of these other versions of Utopias, and I think he's talking a little bit about Twain and Bellamy, which I have read, there is a vast amount of detail about gilding and social arrangements and so forth. Of course, the Eloi and the Morlock are involved in a social relationship, but Wells seems to avoid what he calls detail in favor of a more general descriptions when he writes that the gulf between the capitalists and the laborers results in different species arrangements, and that it followed naturally enough. In other words, what for Twain is very much the subject of his novel, the comedic and violent interactions between people from different cultures, is for Wells abstracted into general laws of nature. He even uses the phrase throughout the laws of nature. Both of these other time travel narratives, Bellamy's and Wells, unlike Twain's, get around the question of messy human interactions like lying. Bellamy does this by assuming the intrinsic goodness of humanity, and Wells does so by zooming forward in time, so Wells's narrative is 800,000 years in the future, as opposed to 100 or a few hundred back. And assuming universal laws. And so even though I dislike the word realism, I actually think Twain's representation of utopia strikes me as more realistic about human interactions and history, because Twain acknowledges how falsehoods and miscommunications operate on a micro level, and how violence and social change operate on a macro level. I think the realism of Twain's fiction is actually secondary, though, to the way that this facilitates a better social critique. All three of the novels go after inequality. Wells critiques inequality with a worst-case future, and Bellamy proposes a solution with an idealized government, but both seem to avoid the question of why and how consolidation of wealth and power happens. Wells ignores the issues by imputing to inequality a universal law on the level of Darwin's evolution, and Bellamy elides the problem by proposing that capitalists would simply give up their wealth willingly in an election. Probably not. In a way, the two novels are inverse romances. Wells supposes inequality is an enduring law of nature, and Bellamy supposes inequality has a simple solution. Of these novels, Twain's is the only one, I think, that looks under the hood at how inequality operates. Why do people believe in superstitious magic or prefer blessed lies? There are certain principles that might explain these questions of inherited culture or habits of mind, but there is no simple answer. In other words, Twain's view of history is more material and contingent, less bound by ahistorical laws of human nature, good or bad. Why does Hank get more obsessed with power and likewise more violent over the course of the story? Well, during the narrative, Hank becomes part of the ruling, privileged class that he critiques. He earns the title, the boss. Because of this position, Hank's tricks become increasingly violent in their quest for power at the expense of his rivals. At one point, Hank uses dynamite to blow up a knight who opposes him. While onlookers see the explosion as a miracle, readers get a description of the steady drizzle of microscopic fragments of knights and hardware and horseflesh. And when King Arthur dies and the full force of the Catholic Church turns on Hank, Twain writes a horrific final chapter that seems to augur the mechanical trench warfare of the First World War. When I was reading this for my comprehensive exams, I was like, there's no way this was written before World War I. There's trench warfare, there's like chemical weapons, it's pretty violent. It's worth noting that this isn't a fully abstract or imaginative killing. Twain gives us some quite graphic images. For example, some of Hank's own men beg him not to order killing. These people are our people, they say. Do not ask us to destroy our own nation. And at one point, Hank finds himself with a hand on a corpse's shoulder, and later surrounded in 3 walls of dead men. This violence ultimately distinguishes Twain's message from Bellamy and from Wells, as both pessimistic and also realist about the quantity and quality of horror associated with social change and quests for power. So my favorite critical interpretation of Connecticut Yankee, and I've spent the last 2 weeks reading a lot of these, is actually the first chapter of Amy Kaplan's 1982 dissertation, which I found via an article from Matt Siebold, Elmira's Matt Siebold, who writes that it's illuminating as anything written about the novel before or after. And her chapter is called Realism and Power, and she argues for the inherent contradictions between Hank's desire to reform medieval England and his desire to control it. I agree with Kaplan almost completely, except for the way that she deals with science. Kaplan seems to see the industrial division of labor and the economic hierarchies inevitably bound up with the consolidation of science becoming less and less accessible as the exclusive property of business. Well, I think Twain is pessimistic about science. I don't think he's that pessimistic. Think of the joy he finds in riffing on the idea of a newspaper written in archaic medieval prose. There's also a section on knights in armor riding on bicycles, which is probably a slide I should have included. Yes, the newspaper is a technological tool of the state, but it can also be a tool for democracy. As John Carlos Rowe puts it more abstractly, Twain is searching for an answer to the question of how to employ technology in the interest of democratic representation. Twain is not critiquing science as necessarily wrapped up in imperial projects of control, but cautioning against certain ways it is used. So in the last few decades of his life, Twain becomes obsessed with US imperialism and also with Christian Science. And I see these obsessions as emerging actually in the prior 2 decades, in the decades when he wrote Connecticut Yankee, and as related. Some scholars point out that Connecticut Yankee can be read as an allegory for imperialism, or colonial exploitation, or more specifically for the violence of the United States towards Native Americans. So the metaphor is Hank's going to 6th century England is like the United States colonizing the Native Americans in the western part of the country. These tendencies for imperial critique become more pronounced later in Twain's career, and scholars like Judith Yaros Lee call the novel a turning point in Twain's writing, and that it anticipates his later satires of imperialism, especially King Leopold's Soliloquy. So King Leopold's Soliloquy is a very late Twain work, and it's a sarcastic diatribe from the perspective of the King of Belgium. Belgium had colonized the Congo at that time. And it takes aim at the abuses of Belgium towards its colony. This short political commentary is worth comparing to Connecticut Yankee because both narrators describe and then justify their own violence on a massive scale. And it also helps us sort of reread Connecticut Yankee because if the King of Belgium is an unreliable narrator, then perhaps Hank is as well. But King Leopold's soliloquy not only attacks the Belgian monarchy, but those complicit in upholding those abuses, including the United States, which propped up the Belgian project under the pretense of reform. As Amanda Claybaugh wrote in the novel of Purpose, Twain had a special ire for what she calls con artist reformers, those who practice imperial extraction under the guise of patronage. In King Leopold's soliloquy, Twain reserves a special attention not just for the direct destruction by Belgium, but by the indirect support of the United States and the United Kingdom under the pretense of reform. Just like Merlin, who lies to obtain his power, or even more closely like Hank, who goes in with a reformist mission but ends up getting corrupted by power, American missionaries and do-gooders to the Congo trying to shift Belgian policy toward democracy and progress often end up doing is reinforcing the existing despotic rule and its horrific violence. Worse, these so-called reformers, and this is part of Twain's argument in King Leopold's soliloquy, convince others and convince themselves that they're bringing change. I want to suggest that Connecticut Yankee contains these early signs of later themes in Twain's writing. That Twain seems to be emphasizing the incredible violence produced by modern technology and how that violence gets going when one political force attempts to reform another, as Hank does in medieval England and as the United States and Belgium do in the Congo. And Twain himself actually later in his 1906 autobiography compares Hank's failed project of reform to the Russian Tsar and to the Belgian rule of the Congo. So just to conclude, these two obsessions of Twain's later years, Christian Science and imperialism, are not only related, but take form earlier in his novel, Connecticut Yankee. The novel is more realist than other utopian fiction of its era, including contemporary time travel narratives of Bellamy and Wells, to the extent that Twain captures the messy idiosyncrasy of human interaction at a micro scale and the violent quest for power at a macro scale. Twain is interested in the ways humans use and abuse systems of knowledge like superstition, science, Christian Science, the rhetoric of reform, and others to try to control and dominate each other. He acknowledges that people, even his own mother, often don't want the truth, and the ways that structures of power use and abuse these tendencies to believe. As I've attempted to argue, Connecticut Yankee theorizes science and belief, and the novel critiques the way that powerful forces manipulate knowledge systems to violent ends. These con artist reformers, or charlatan scientists and magicians, will occupy Twain for the rest of his life.